The year was 1940. It was in the early part of World War II, and the German forces were inflicting heavy casualties on the Allied forces of Britain and France. And as those powerful Nazi troops swept across Europe, the 350,000 soldiers of the Allied army were forced to retreat. Finally, they ran out of space to retreat. They were trapped on a beach against the sea across the English Channel in Dunkirk, France. The German forces were on their way with the capacity to completely obliterate their enemies. And when it seemed certain that the Allied forces at Dunkirk were about to be massacred, a British naval officer cabled just 3 words back to London: "But if not." Those words were instantly recognizable to the people who were accustomed to hearing the scriptures read in church, the people who were familiar with the book of Daniel. And the message in those 3 words was clear. The situation was desperate. The Allied forces were trapped. It would take a miracle to save them, but they were determined not to give in. And the commander was saying that even if his troops could not be delivered from the approaching German armies, they would never surrender. For some reason, people are still not sure why, the Nazis hesitated. They backed off momentarily. British families and fishermen heard about the desperate cry for help, and they responded. They answered with merchant marine boats and with pleasure cruisers and even with small fishing boats, evacuating more than 338,000 soldiers to safety. The massive operation involving hundreds of naval and civilian vessels became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. And many believe it served as a turning point in that war. Did you bring a Bible with you today? Let's spend some time in the book of Daniel, shall we? We provided an outline for you as you entered the service today. If you want to pull that out, feel free to fill in the blanks, jot down some additional references as we move through our study today. Well, we made it. It's been almost 25 years since I've attempted to teach this challenging material in a Sunday morning worship format, but I decided to take another run at it in recent weeks. And the reason for that is because, in my humble opinion, the content and message of this book could not be timelier. Over the past few months, we've done our best to dissect and inspect the individual trees that make up this material. Before we close out this series and move on, I'd like to step back one more time and try to appreciate the entire forest. So specifically today, I want to drill down on what I believe are 3 primary takeaways from this series, from this study. I'm hoping that in weeks, months to come, as you reflect back on what we've learned and what we've examined through this book, that these are the points that you'll be holding on to, that you'll retain. The first one would be this: primary takeaway number 1, the book of Daniel is a call to courageously stand for our convictions. There are 3 specific incidents in this book where Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, you probably know them better as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 3 specific incidents where they refused to cave in. Under the threat of severe consequences, they would not budge. The first you'll recall was back in chapter 1, where Daniel and friends said no to the king's special diet, mainly because Old Testament law condemned the practice of eating meat that had been sacrificed to pagan deities. And so chapter 1, verse 8, we read, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. King James translates, but Daniel purposed in his heart. New American Standard says he made up his mind. And Daniel's buddies followed his lead, didn't they? When faced with the next challenge, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego took the heat, both literally and figuratively. We're not even sure where Daniel was on this particular occasion, but chapter 3 makes it clear that when King Nebuchadnezzar commanded everyone to bow to the image that he had set up as soon as they heard the music, these three men refused to go along with the crowd. They courageously remained standing and then boldly replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king." In other words, they were saying here, if our God can find it possible to deliver us in terms of what he sees best, then we're confident that he will deliver. Now look, verse 18. But even if he does not, there it is, right? But if not. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you've set up. The third and final occurrence comes in chapter 6 when Daniel's zealous peers cleverly deceived King Darius into signing into a law made it illegal for anyone to pray to any god other than the king for 30 days. And of course, anybody who violated that law would be tossed into the lion's den, right? And I'm guessing you remember how that played out. Chapter 6, verse 10. Now when Daniel learned the decree had been published, he went to his upstairs room with the windows open towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. I think it's probably obvious by now. Daniel and company courageously went against the flow. Now, why is that important? Because that is now our reality. We're swimming upstream against the flow. Much like Pastor Jim Garlow stated when he compared our culture, you recall back in the early weeks of this study, to 2 locomotives on the same track, both running at high speeds, one of those locomotives being religious freedom, the other one a radical secularist agenda. And then he made this statement. He said, these two cannot coexist in the same nation at the same time. We are citizens of Jerusalem, but we're residents of Babylon. In other words, we're on a collision course, aren't we? It's only a matter of time. And so the question that we need to be asking ourselves is, how can we best be faithful to our calling in a world where it will never be normal to be a Christian? How can we best be faithful in a culture that's becoming increasingly hostile and antagonistic to godly values? I don't know if you're familiar with the name Frank Turek. He's a Christian author, public speaker, radio host. He travels the country training believers on how to respond to attacks against our faith. I was listening to one of his podcasts this past week, and he told the story of how at one of his recent events, a little girl came to the microphone during the question and answer time. And this is what she said: I'm 12 years old, and I go to an elementary school where many of my friends are claiming to be trans or LGBTQ, and many of my other friends are supporting them. I feel like I'm the only one who doesn't agree. What can I do? And Frank summarized, he said, here's a little girl from Charlotte, North Carolina. So basically we're talking the Bible Belt in this country. And yet this 12-year-old is being bombarded with transgender ideology in her elementary school, and she wants to know how she can stand for the truth. Frank went on to say that that bold young girl received a standing ovation from the crowd that day. Gang, this is not the time to keep quiet. This is not the time for us to hide. This is not the time to keep our heads down and hope that nobody notices. This is the time to courageously stand for our convictions. I heard a pastor named Russell Johnson who expressed it like this. Thought this was a good statement. He said, when the church loses her voice, the world loses its mind. And that's exactly what we see happening in our world today, isn't it? The church too often is being silent. The church has lost her voice, and we see how that is being played out now in the world, in the culture around us. Daniel is a call to courageously stand for our convictions. Primary takeaway number 2, it's a call to closely walk with our God. One of the descriptions that accurately characterizes Daniel's life was that of godly integrity. When I think of Daniel, I think of godly integrity. I told you that Daniel is one of the few characters in the Bible where we have a significant amount of material written about his life, and yet nothing negative is recorded about him. That's unusual, because the Bible's it paints the picture warts and all, and tells us everything about people. So we have a substantial amount of Daniel, and he still comes out shining with godly integrity. I think that came through very clearly in chapter 6. His enemies are trying to dig up dirt on him. Remember their conclusion? At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel and his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Is that incredible or what? This guy worked for the government. Come on. Are you kidding me? Here's Daniel living in a hostile pagan environment for at least 70 years. And yet, to the best of our knowledge, he never compromised his standards. He walked intimately with his God. I've already made the point in this series, but I want to come back to it one more time, that prayer and fasting were a regular part of his routine. We saw that, remember, back in chapter 2, when the prophet asked his friends to diligently pray for him, that he would have insight and wisdom to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We saw it again in chapter 6. In fact, we just read it there. After the king issued the decree denying prayer, what did Daniel do? 3 times a day, just as he had always done. Gets down on his knees and begins to pray. Let me give you one more. Daniel chapter 9. Remember, we studied the content of one of the prophet's prayers as he cries out to God in repentance for his people. And how did he do so? Well, verse 3 sets it up by saying he was pleading with God in prayer, petition, in fasting, and in sackcloth and ashes. One of the points that I didn't mention to you in that study of chapter 9, just couldn't fit it in, too much content that day, but there's a detail in verse 21. It says, while I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I'd seen in the earlier vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice. So I want you to notice there, at the very end of that verse, Daniel is observing the time of the evening sacrifice. Wait, what? When was the last evening sacrifice? 70 years ago. The temple had been destroyed 70 years earlier. When Daniel and company had been carried off into exile, and yet here's Daniel living in Babylon, and he's still maintaining and observing the disciplines of his faith 70 years later. What a track record. He was a citizen of Jerusalem who just happened to be residing in Babylon. And we need to do the same. We need to follow Daniel's example. Understanding the urgency of the days in which we live, we must make our spiritual development and walking intimately with God our top priority. I've used this story a lot, but I haven't used it here at City on a Hill yet. I'm going to use it today. Francis Chan calls it one of the most powerful testimonies he's ever read. Her name was Esther An Kim. During World War II, the Japanese occupation of Korea, Esther, like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow down at the shrines that had been set up in her country, and consequently, she was imprisoned for 6 years from 1939 to 1945. But here's the interesting part. Recognizing that she'd probably end up in prison, recognizing what was about to take place, she started to train herself both physically and spiritually, for what was coming. You say, Gary, how in the world does she do that? Well, physically, each day she would find and eat decaying food, rotting food, because she figured that's what she was going to be served in prison. But more importantly, she memorized more than 100 chapters of the Bible, many hymns, because she knew that she'd not have access to the Word of God in prison. And she spent countless hours seeking God through fasting and prayer. And ultimately, the intimacy that she nurtured in her time with God enabled her to overcome her fear of being tortured. When she eventually was taken to prison, God used her there in a powerful way. Even the jailers and the government officials noticed how Esther shone brightly in that very dark environment. There's a method to my madness. There's not always a method to my madness, but on this particular occasion, there was a method to my madness. And so the candy bar challenge, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And then we tacked on Hebrews 13:5 and 6, didn't we? Keep your lives free from the love of money. Be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. And so we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? And then I gave you an easy one. I will lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Now, why did I do that? Because I thought maybe if you took me up on the challenge and you committed yourself to memorizing those verses, the light bulb would click on and you'd say, oh, I can do this. I can memorize God's word. I can hide it away in my heart. And maybe as a result of that, you might even do some research on other verses that would be meaningful to you for you to memorize. I've also been challenging you in recent weeks to consider adding the practice of fasting to your spiritual disciplines. Why? Because bottom line, we live in very uncertain times. We don't know what's coming, but it seems pretty obvious. And one of the best ways that we can prepare for the days ahead is to follow the example of Esther An Kim by studying the Scriptures, memorizing them, hiding them away in our hearts, and seeking God through fasting and prayer. The book of Daniel is a call to walk closely with our God. Finally, primary takeaway number 3, it's a call to confidently trust God in the midst of our testing. Not everybody's going to agree with me at this point, but I believe a good portion of Daniel's prophetic material is devoted to a coming world ruler known as the Antichrist. And I tried to make the case for that in Daniel chapter 7, where he's specifically referred to as the little horn. And you'll recall we read in verse 21, it said, as I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints, or some translations say the holy people, and defeating them. A little bit further into that chapter, verse 25, he will speak against the Most High. He, the Antichrist, will speak, he'll blaspheme against God, and now oppress his saints and try to change the set times and laws, and the saints will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. Who exactly are these saints? Who exactly are these holy people? Well, that's up for debate. But this much we can say with confidence. In the last days, the Antichrist will unleash his fury against those who belong to God. And one of the points that I tried to establish in this series is how easily this coming world figure could rise to power in our day. Now, you maybe have noted, I hope you have, I've been very careful in this series not to engage in wild speculation. I've not set any dates for the return of Jesus, nor will we. Down through the centuries, the church has actually been discredited for that very reason. We set dates. We say this is going to happen on this occasion. Nothing materializes, and the church looks foolish. So no, we haven't set any dates, but what I have tried to indicate is how many of the necessary components seem to be lining up. It seems like the stage is being set to make the rise of the Antichrist a possibility. For example, I told you there's a strong push now for globalization, a one-world government. Organizations like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, if you read, if you listen to what they're promoting, it's very obvious. There's no trying to hide it. Many are insisting it's time to move to a central bank digital currency. The idea there is our money would all become digitalized and as a result, programmable. In other words, authorities could control how much you spend and what you spend it on, or maybe even shut down your bank account if you've stepped out of line. With the improvements in modern technology, especially when it comes to surveillance and facial recognition, our location can be tracked anywhere on this planet. So it isn't hard to see. You know, you begin to look at some of these things in Bible prophecy, and all of a sudden, yeah, it's clear all these factors could be used for nefarious purposes if placed in the wrong hands. One conclusion that seems pretty safe. Barring a sweeping revival across this nation, tensions are only going to continue to increase between a secular culture and those who follow Jesus. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but 2023 is on track to record the largest number of anti-Christian church attacks of any year to date. The number of church attacks here in the United States nearly tripled in the first quarter compared to 2022. Assailants torched, vandalized, or committed acts of gun or bomb-related violence against United States churches 69 times in the first 3 months of 2023. You can do the research yourself. You can find those stats. They're not hard to track down. Pastor Erwin Lutzer, in his book, No Reason to Hide, a book that I endorsed at the outset of this study and series, Lutzer writes this. He says, secularism is never neutral. As it gains momentum, it will attempt to silence the voices of those who speak against it. We had better rediscover the lessons the church learned through the 2,000 years of its history, that a suffering church is almost always a powerful church, and a compromising church is like salt that has lost its savor. If we have no conflict with the world, we are not true to the gospel. As has been said, we do not suffer for what we profess. We only suffer for what we truly believe. My fear is he's right. I'll just be real honest with you today. I'm going to shoot straight with you this morning. I'm afraid. I'm afraid that we've had it so good in this country over the past couple hundred of years that we've convinced ourselves that it will always be that way. It will never change. I'm afraid that we've grown soft. I'm afraid that the 21st century American church no longer understands the theology of suffering. This whole notion that God can use persecution and heartaches and disappointment and trial for our welfare. That whole idea is a foreign subject to so many in the church these days. I want you to understand, I'm not trying to frighten you, okay? I'm not trying to scare you. But I think it's just so critical that we're realistic about the potential difficulties that we could face in the days to come. We need to prepare. If you'd like to learn more of where I'm coming from, I listed 2 resources there on the back side of your outline today, the very bottom of the page. The first is a series of short video clips from Andrew Brunson. He's a missionary who was imprisoned in Turkey He's done a series of, I think there's 8 short video clips of what he sees happening in our country and could potentially take place in our lifetimes. The other resource is a series of video clips done by Focus on the Family with Rod Dreher. And I couldn't put the exact link. It would not copy directly onto the outline. And so if you go to your web browser and just type in that Embracing God's Truth in a Hostile Culture, Focus on the Family, Rod Dreher, if you bring that up in your search engine, it should get you to the page where you can sign up and watch. These videos are free. You can watch them for free. It's kind of heavy stuff, but it's important material, and I would encourage you, when you have opportunity, to take a look. It's interesting, Erwin Lutzer actually